Norm Roule, welcome to the Cipher Brief.
Thank you.
This new rebel coalition in Syria, Norm, launched this attack in the country's second largest city of Aleppo. This is really a conflict that for more than 10 years has been going on. There was somewhat of a stalemate, I feel like. Can you just kind of bring us up to speed on where we are in Syria right now?
Sure. So we're watching the latest chapter in a conflict that the world has ignored, and one more eruption of turbulence in a region that has been jolted by tectonic political and military movements over the past year and a half. This conflict in Syria right now represents a potential inflection point for the region. Although the Syrian regime does not appear in danger of falling, how and whether and to what extent Iran and Russia respond will shape events in the region for the foreseeable future. I think when you look at this, to me, although it's obviously a serious story, the primary implications are for Iran and its Quds Force empire. The Quds Force has never faced such repeated and effective blows and terrible disasters. It's not out. It has thousands of personnel who are left, but they now face the arrival of a Trump administration in January. I think because of Syria and other events and the Trump administration's arrival, we are likely to see an internal debate within Iran itself as to how they should respond to the West. My last 2 points, and just sort of an overview, is Syria is the most complicated geography in the Middle East. There are a few good actors. Some of the actors are quite bloody, and in the end, this chapter tells us once again that the Biden administration is leaving office with the region more contested and more dangerous than any time since 1945. So, how did we get here? Where are we? Well, in 2011, Arab Spring, Syria is under threat. Iran sends its forces in under the Quds Force because Syria represents its only state ally. And in 2013 and 2014, operations were not going well. The Quds Force was losing multiple senior officers. The number of funerals for Quds Force officials were increasing in Iran. And even in some of the demonstrations in Iran, you had protesters asking why Iranian funds were spent in wars abroad instead of at home. The Quds Force traveled to Russia in 2015 with Qasem Soleimani meeting Putin and convinced the Russians to involve themselves more thoroughly in Syria. Why was this important? The Quds Force lacked air capacity, it lacked battlefield management capacity, it lacked good artillery experience, and Russia brought all of this to the table. Aleppo, the city in question this week, fell in 2016, but took probably 4 years of fighting and perhaps 100,000, at the very least, tens and tens of thousands of casualties. And the fact that Aleppo has fallen so quickly now compared to then tells you how much the world has changed. Since that time, the Syrian geography is just extraordinarily complicated. Assad kind of sort of controls the center and the south, the Kurds, the northeast, Islamic militants, the northwest, Turkey, a strip in the north, the Iranians in the east and in the west, the Americans in the northeast and sort of the north central. I mean, this is a mess, and it's been sitting for years. On November 27th, Syrian Islamic militants, primarily led by the group Hayat Tahrir Shem, headquarters for the liberation of the Levant, launched an attack on Aleppo, and the city fell quickly. This is a terrible intelligence failure for the Syrians, the Russians, and the Iranians simultaneously. This attack tells you an awful lot about their capabilities in the region, how thinned out they were. And in some ways, it's a systematic failure, not dissimilar to October 7th in Israel. So this group, Hayat Tahrir Shams and the Kurds, are the two largest of the Syrian opposition movements. The Islamists came inside, reassured the population, which includes a large Christian presence, that they would not be harmed, their belongings would not be touched. But then the opposition discovered that the Syrians had abandoned massive amount of ordnance, anti-tank guided missiles, man pads. And this is important because in the past, the Syrian opposition was always incapable of competing against Syrian and Russian armor. So they would take villages, take cities, and then the Syrians would come with armor, and they didn't have the anti-tank missiles to send out. The Syrian government claims it's preparing a counteroffensive. It's possible that they're waiting to see if the rebels thin themselves out in this conflict before they move forward. The Iranians have responded by dispatching their foreign minister to Moscow or to Turkey and to Damascus. The Iranians apparently had a casualty, a senior Quds Force officer, a general, Qiyomar Hashemi, died in the fighting, and he was described as a as a military advisor to the Syrian regime. So we're now watching people start to respond. The Russians have sent a senior official. They've relieved their official on the spot who previously was fired from his work in Ukraine, and we're going to see how this plays out in coming days.
Norm, you mentioned this is one of the most complicated areas of the world. It feels like the entire region's been pulled into this. Everybody has a stake in Syria. What's at stake in Syria for the United States, and what's at stake for Russia?
Well, for Russia, they need the bases at their bases at, I'm sorry, naval bases at Tartus and Latakia because this allows them to maintain a naval presence outside of the Black Sea. And they also have an a logistics line based in those locations that allow them to support operations in Libya and Africa. The loss of Syria for the Russian military would be very consequential. For the United States, we don't want to see the return of ISIS, and ISIS has it still remains a regional or a local problem, but there have been significant developments regarding ISIS in the past year. The nature of its attacks are increasing, and the sophistication. They're demanding funds from businesses to stay afloat. ISIS is far from out, and although the militants who are responsible for the capture of Aleppo claim that they are not radical, Hayat Tahrir Shams formerly was associated with Al-Qaeda. They broke away. The idea of Islamic militants in charge of such central geography would be a terrific and consequential complication to the region, touching countries such as Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, Jordan. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on of why you would want stability in Syria.
Let's talk a little bit too, Norm, because I feel like it's important about Turkey's role in this and what's at stake for Turkey as well.
So Turkish history with Syria is also, well, I hate to overuse the word complicated. Syria, there are parts of Syrian territory that were once part of the Ottoman Empire and Turkey itself, and Turkish nationalists see that as their territory. The Turks view the Kurdish actors that the United States supports as terrorists, as related to the PKK, and they believe that a presence in Syria allows them to push back this threat by Kurdish militants. The Kurds have had an on again, off again effort to build relations with Assad. I think in recent months it was kind of sort of on again, but that never seems to last. What I think we're probably likely to see with the Trump administration or the world in general is to say that Turkey will have a lot more influence or responsibility for Syria, if only because nobody else wishes to involve themselves in this mess.
Interesting. All right. Well, let's stick to the region and the impact there for a moment. What does this mean for Israel?
Well, for Israel, it's in the near term good news. This puts Iran's architecture in Syria under greater threat, under greater pressure, means that the Quds Force will have less time and personnel to spend to reconstitute Hezbollah, which is Iran's primary goal following the ceasefire in Lebanon. Looking forward, I think it's an open question and probably a threat. Some members of the Islamic militants have openly stated that they're fighting Israel's enemies and that Israel's enemies are their enemies. But these are Salafists who have at the same time made a number of anti-Israel comments over the years. And I don't think it's in Israel's interest to have a Salafist militant government on their border. For Israel, they became, as many did in the region, comfortable with the stalemate. comfortable with the devil they know, that is Assad, comfortable with the fact that Assad was too weak to participate in Israeli attacks, I mean Iranian attacks on Israel itself, and would just have to stand by when Israel attacked the Iranians. I think we're going to see a lot of attention paid by Israel on what's happening, but as long as the Assad regime is not threatened in Damascus, I don't think Israel will worry too much.
What kind of response are you expecting, given everything you just told us? What kind of response could be launched in reaction to this attack?
So, if you're the rebels right now, you need to make sure that you've got Aleppo under control, set up your defenses for a counterattack by Syrian, Russian, and Iranian forces. You've got to see what you can do with all these wonderful man pads and anti-tank weapons that have fallen into your lap. There will be some thought that the Syrians will want to push south to Hama, the cities of Hama, and to Homs. That would be important because if they capture these historic cities, Homs would cut Damascus off from the Russian base at Tartus. So it's a question of will the rebels be able to uh, properly mount these attacks or constrain themselves or decide they can't go any farther because they don't want to thin out their lines? That's what I see happening in the next few days there. For the Russians, they've replaced their commander. They've brought a new one in who's quite tough. He will bring in air support against the rebels in Aleppo, but also in Idlib. He will also bring in some artillery. I think it's going to be risk being quite bloody. For the Iranians, they're going to marshal a number of different forces. Lebanese Hezbollah is not out. It's just a lot less and a lot less capable. The Iranians have a lot less experience. And I think we need to look at the last year for a moment because, or last couple of years, it's not just the Iranians lost Qasem Soleimani, but think of the number of generals and mid-level senior officers the Israelis have killed in Iran's Syria operational elements over the past year. The April 2023 consulate or embassy compound attack took out 7 of their most experienced Syrian officers. So Iran has less experience. I think we're going to watch the Iranians send in ground operations personnel so that they can manage their limited Hezbollah operatives. They're Afghans who have been tested. They're not the best soldiers in the world, but they have been tested, along with the Pakistanis and the demoralized, weakened Syrian army, which is really almost a bystander, it seems, in some of these events. It will take some time to marshal, lay out these forces, to move them together, to come up with a plan. And I think this operation will play out over the next week to 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. But for Iran, they've got to demonstrate that they're standing with Assad. Iran has been unable to stand with Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. Iran's reputation of having a connection to its proxies has suffered tremendously, and it simply must stand with Bashar al-Assad if it's going to retain any credibility in the region. And if it doesn't, that becomes an opportunity for the West, for the region, because it's a different Middle East if Iran no longer has that connection. I think if you're the Quds Force right now in Tehran, you're making this argument of we must do this. The supreme leader and others will say, that's fine, but we fight to the last proxy. We're not going to have an uptick on losses of generals. We're not going to spend a lot of money on this at a time when our economy is weak. So manage this accordingly. If you're the Syrians, their army is weak, tired, demoralized. They kind of ran away from Aleppo. Their intelligence apparently isn't very good. There have been rumors of coup attempts in Damascus, probably untrue, but that's unknown. I think the one question or the one issue I would put forward is most of these movements will not be visible to outsiders, hopefully to intelligence services, to include the U.S., obviously. But we're going to see the contours of this play out. But as Iran moves its forces in and Russia responds, unless you've got some terrific on-the-ground insights, we just won't see this in the West. So some patience will be required to see how this plays out, and people should hurry up and slow down with their analysis accordingly.
hmm Norm, you spent the bulk of your career advising policymakers. You served as a national intelligence manager for Iran at ODNI. Since retiring, you travel to the region regularly. You know it better than anyone else I know. I want to ask you if you were briefing policymakers today on the opportunities that exist out of this taking of Aleppo, what opportunities would you be telling them to look for in the coming days and weeks?
Anything we can do to degrade Iran's capacity to operate in Syria would be useful. Anything we can do to stay away from staying away from Russian aircraft and Russian operations will be important because we don't want to risk a conflict with Russia as they're engaged in this issue. Making sure that we have very close relations with our Gulf partners because the Gulf partners see Syria as a source of Captagon, as a source of an Iranian threat, and their historical access to the region is much deeper than ours. So this is a time for close involvement with those parties. I don't think we need to have a military presence in this area, but I would watch with our relations with the SDF whether Daesh decides this is an opportunity for it to expand its own activities in the villages around the El Hul displaced persons camp and elsewhere in Syria. So I would have our personnel supported appropriately with intelligence and logistics to protect them and to push back in any possible Daesh action. I would also try last to stay in close contact with the Turks. I would want to make sure I understand how far the Turks are willing to go in this issue, where they see themselves going in 6 months or 6 weeks, even as this goes forward. So this is a time for some very important diplomacy and intelligence engagement.
hmm Norm Roule, former National Intelligence Manager for Iran at the ODNI. We're proud to say a Cipher Brief expert. Thank you so much for taking the time to give us some context around this important development in Syria. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Suzanne.